style has a lot to do with technique, right? Like when you have a proper technique or an efficient technique, then style kind of comes through. They want to throw a lot more spray. They cut the flow because their cutting turns short. Let's work on holding that rhythm.
Welcome to the Basis Podcast. We're with Magnum Martinez, a pro surfer. He was the Masters ISA world champ. He's an Olympic coach. Has a little daughter named Shakti who absolutely rips. That's actually how I met Magnum for the first time. I saw this tiny little girl just ripping on on this wave, and then after her wave, I see Magnum on the next wave, and I was like, wow, that's quite the father-daughter duo. Probably going to be like the next Caroline Marks or something like that. He's based in Puerto Rico, and very honored to have you, Magnum. Thanks for joining.
Thanks so much, man, for having me in your podcast. I really like your approach to everything you're doing, and how you're diving into like some interesting aspects of surfing in many different ways. So thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure.
Awesome. Thanks. Appreciate the kind words. All right. So why don't we dive into it? Why don't we start off with kind of the beginning of your journey, how you got into surfing? I think it's an interesting story because you're from Venezuela, from my understanding, which is, I'm sure that they get waves. I mean, they're kind of tucked up there right in the Caribbean, but they're not known for world-class waves, So on that Atlantic side, kind of like, where Argentina, Brazil, etc. So why don't we start there? How did you get into surfing? Did you come from a surfing family, or how did it all start for you?
Yeah, so I was born and raised in Venezuela, and I'm actually from Caracas, from the capital city. So I didn't grow up near the beach, even though my parents will take us to the beach, since we're little. But I was more into soccer and other sports, living in the city. My dad was a good water guy, like a diver and like spearfishing and free diver. So from a young age, we got introduced to the water and the open ocean, and he kind of gave us the swimming background and all this stuff, which it helped a lot once being in the ocean. But I didn't start surfing until I was 15 years old. That was the very first time I actually hopped on a fiberglass surfboard, if you want to call it that way, because we did like a little season down at one beach club that we used to go to on a bodyboard. My brother and I have a younger brother. His name is Cherokee, and he's 2 years younger than me, and we used to do everything together, close in age. So yeah, it was him who actually got me into it. Like, he started surfing right before me. And the quick story is that we're in Margarita Island, which is a nice, beautiful island, very touristy in Venezuela. And we were actually, this time of the year, it was August, September, and there was this hurricane swell that just swung by, and the waves are pumping. And I was like, we're hanging out at the beach, and my brothers were sitting there on the beach, and I'm looking at the ocean. I'm like, wow, that's fun, whatever, I'm going to go out. And I grabbed the board, and I'm actually on my way out, not having a clue what I'm doing, except for that, being able to get on a bodyboard and swim out. And then my brother actually ran after me and like stopped me. He's like, "What are you doing? You're gonna drown." And it was actually pretty solid. Yeah. And he stopped me right then, and he's like, "Hey, no, let's do it. If you really want to learn, let's go to the whitewater." And he actually pushed me into a couple of whitewaters, and I stood up, and I was like, wow, this is like, next level. I really got hooked. And then we went back to Caracas and linked up with some of my buddies that were already surfing, and then start going down the beach, which is another story, another process of getting to the beach back then. And that's how everything started, surfing in Venezuela.
Oh, wow.
This is 89, by the way.
89. Nice. Wow, so your brother saved you from certain death by not letting you go into gigantic pumping hurricane swell like on your first time surfing. That's pretty funny.
I was probably going to get really worked because I remember I have a picture of waves actually top to bottom. It was like solid, like gnarly beach rig, and I was just like kind of clueless.
Wow. So you lived in Caracas. How far away is Caracas from, the surf?
So the very first place that you hit as you go down the beach is like you come down, and you start seeing the ocean, and there's the airport, the international airport, and that's about somewhat around 30 minutes. But the beaches around there, we didn't frequent those places. We went farther down the coast, so we had to drive once we were down at the beach, and so the closest place was like 40 minutes, 45 minutes every time to an hour, which was like the farthest one away. This Los Caracas, it's a point break, right-hand point break. And that's one of my favorite waves till the day. And so I grew up surfing Playa Los Cocos, Pantaleta, and Los Caracas. That was the three main spots. And they were different, which actually helped me in my surfing later on. Los Caracas, a little kind of mushy, fun point break, cobblestone. Pantaletas like this peaky, weird, like moody beach break. And Los Cocos is this like wedging left, barreling off this jetty in front of a hotel. And that's kind of that, and the characters around is what shaped me in the first few years of my life as a surfer.
Oh, nice. That's super fascinating. So you grew up a little bit inland, so it wasn't as easy as just like you just walk to the beach and you go surf. So how often were you able to surf, and how often were you able to surf when you were younger?
Well, at first it was like if I got to the beach twice a week, it was like that was good, on the weekends at first, because I was 15, and it was an interesting stage of my life because I've always felt like I was meant to be an athlete of some sort, and I was really, really into soccer. It was like I felt like I had the potential to become a professional soccer player, but I kind of hit like a moment where I couldn't find, like from like 14 going on, I couldn't find a club to join, and it was like kind of got lost. Started partying the girls, and the whole scene in the city was crazy. And got a little lost there. And then surfing was kind of like, oh, wow. And then I started surfing, and I was just so hooked. And it was a mission to get to the beach. First of all, we got to find somebody that had a car to drive us. And then not only that, but then, there's cops on the ways. They'll pull you over. If you look too young, they'll want money, the whole thing. And then it was a mission to get to the beach. And back then there was no surf report, nothing. So you show up and it could be 1 foot blown out, and that's what you got. And that's what you had to deal with. So that helped me gain this appreciation for surfing that till the day. And I think until the day my last day on this earth, I'm going to have for surfing. I see 1-2 foot waves out of hobos. And I see some of my students kind of like, yeah, it's small. I'm like, no, bro, that's like her sister. Go get out there. Those are actually surfable waves, and you can have fun. It's part of the whole process. So, yeah, the waves were, often very subpar, like windy, small, like, so obviously gets good, but a lot of times there was not much to be had.
So do you think that actually was one of the keys to you getting better as a surfer, in that you would just go, and even if it was bad, you would still surf because you spent an hour to get there and you learned how to surf bad waves? Or how do you think that shaped your approach?
Yeah, it definitely did. And it shaped it in a few ways. And like, first of all, it was like, it took me a good like 5-6 months to even get going. Because back then it's not like now, like, oh, let's go to the instructor, jump on a foamy, get on the white water. They push you, they teach you how to pop up, all this stuff previous, back then it wasn't like that. It was like somebody like handing you a board. It had nothing to do with what you were capable to ride or your weight or your height, nothing. Here, there's a surfboard, get out there. And they barely tell you a tip or two, and then you're just getting murdered. It's hilarious, and you're getting caught. I remember cutting my feet with the fence and rashes, and you just disaster. It was really funny, but that kind of like creates and it kind of seeds this deeply appreciation for where you grow up and the environment. And the waves being not good a lot of the times, also when the waves got good, it was like this, like beyond this euphoria that as we're coming down that road, when we first see the ocean, we're trying to see if there's lines, if there's a little white water on the jetty by the port. And it's just, it's really hard to explain, but that whole thing, it was so big, so large to be able to, experience all that just before we touch the water, that I have the utmost respect for surfing.
Yeah, that sounds very magical.
Yeah.
And so how did you get so good then, surfing, relatively infrequently? Like, did you, that's fascinating because I think a lot of people can relate to that. They might be weekend warriors. They might not live close to the beach. So, how did you get so good? Because you obviously are an extremely talented surfer. If you couldn't go surf all the time.
Well, thanks for the kind words. I actually do not consider myself a highly talented surfer. I am more of like a self-made, hardworking, like dedicated surfer that actually went from being at 15. I sucked really hard at surfing. I had a horrible stance, horrible style, and like I worked really hard. Like at that point when I realized that I wasn't going to be a soccer player and surfing just captivated my heart and had all my energy, all I knew is that I wanted to give it everything I had. That's the only thing I knew for certain, and I had, there was really good surfers and during that time of the history of surfing in Venezuela, late 80s, early 90s. So from the get-go, I was looking at guys like Pedro Rangel, Sergio Martins, like Enrique Aular, and some of these guys were like, they were competing out at Soup Bowls and the World ISAs against Kelly, Taylor Knox, Rob Machado, Chris Brown. Peter Rangel beat Chris Brown several times. And there's a story of Chris Brown going to All-American, going like, man, I don't know who's this kid, this dark kid from Venezuela, but every time I paddle out with him, he waxes me. And so there is a lot of like history in Venezuelan surfing that not a lot of people know about. And so it was actually a blessing for me to be introduced to surfing very late during, at 15, learning just at 15. But being able to see all these characters, all these really good surfers already, and kind of just being in awe of them and just going like, okay, I got it, I love this and I'm going to do my best. So I really put a lot of time into it, even though I can only, sometimes it was like one day out of the week. Then finally I got a car and I used to skip school, go to the beach, and any chance, go to the beach at 3 p.m., show up, surf for like an hour and a half or something. It was like, there was a lot of effort, and again, all that, I think all that, like, all those dynamics kind of gave me that appreciation that when I was able to surf, I just gave it everything I had. And I think that's what made me, want it so badly and get better quicker. Because then by the time I was like, 17, I was already competing. And then the last year of my juniors, I won the last event as a junior. And I was like, okay, national heroes, and being like, okay, you guys are way better than me, but I'm catching up. So it was a really cool experience.
That's fascinating. Hey everyone, it's Van. Hopefully you've been enjoying the podcast. Hopefully you've been listening to some good stories, getting some good tips that are helping you improve as a surfer. If so, make sure to subscribe to the podcast, leave us a review. It'll only take you literally a few seconds, and share it with your friends. That's the best way you can support me so I can continue to create awesome new content for you. And I imagine So some of the people you might have been competing against, maybe they grew up surfing since they were little kids, the way Shakti probably is, right? And so when you're I'm actually curious as a father and how you see how she learns. I just imagine that when you learn at such a young age, it's much more of this intuitive process. But then if you're learning at 15, not to mention if you're learning at an even later stage, you have to be a lot more analytical and figure things out. It doesn't come as naturally.
Yeah.
So, what was it like for you when you were trying to figure out how to do maneuvers and all this, watching your peers? Like, what was that like for you and how did you improve? I mean, was it just simply watching your peers and just trying to emulate them? Did you just really have to break things down? What was your approach? How did you get good to the point where you were beating them finally, eventually?
Yeah, that's a great question because I'll go and then I'll jump into my daughter's example real quick after. But we were so gung-ho about surfing and so in love with it that we'll spend hours watching surf videos. I watched Pump by Billabong somehow probably north of 500 times. I still watch it to the day. I have Shakti watch, Aki and things like that. We watch Tom Curran, we watch Black and White, all those videos like the Hawaii 9.0s, 9.1s, just what it was hot during that time when I was learning how to surf, the Wave Warriors, Pods, Fletchers, Mark Archibald, and Dino, Shane, all these legends. And it was I don't know if it was different then. And I want to say somehow it was different, but the magazines, there was something that really captivated you and inspired you back then to surf and to look at those guys, look at the contests and look at the things that they were doing and the way they were surfing. That was just wow. And then you at that time, which was out of the water and our, home in the city, not being able to watch a video and go surfing, but to wait until maybe next day or the following day or hear if somebody went to the beach and there was waves. So going down there and then, if you ran into a good surfer, then you learn from them. But I also had the blessing to have one of my best friends growing up. He was older, he had a car, and he was a good surfer, but he was really analytical and he was very technical driven. He liked to break down things, and he was like a mentor to me. Two of them, Eduardo Espinosa and Tote, which later on Tote had a surf shop, end up give me a job at the surf shop and give me boards and then sponsor me Advanced Surf Shop back in the day. So I owe so much to those guys, but they drove me to kind of understand better to hey, go to the bottom, do a bottom turn. And, as you're aware, on waves that are short period, like there are mostly in Venezuela that are quick, you're not thinking in bottom turning, you want to go down the line, but the blessing was that we have point breaks that are slow enough of waves that allow you to learn the flow and to read the wave and not to get ahead of it. Because if you only surf, fast, closing out beach rigs, then you're just trying to gain speed and be reactive. Whereas a point break gives you that other perspective, the other option to read the wave, to think a little bit more, have more time to, have better timing, and brush your skills on a slower wave. Use the rails, stay in the pocket, all these things. So it was all that, all these things that kind of shaped my surfing. But those guys that really helped me out and kind of were my mentors, helped me a lot. Back then, there was not really coaches like there is not nowadays that are really precise, that will teach you a whole lot of stuff. It was more just a little bit of info, a little bit of insight, and a lot of do it, a lot of pushing you to do it, hey, you surf that, hit it harder. That's a typical hit it harder. They're not telling you kick your back leg more or like compress and decompress and switch your, your weight. They're just telling you hit it harder. And you got the message. It's like, okay, I got to hit it harder somehow. I got, it's like, so I don't know. It's funny because it was really raw, but I think watching videos a lot. Then I learned later on watching tennis, and I'm not a good tennis player, but when I first grabbed a racket, I watched so much tennis that I could actually play way better than I expected to play because my brain had been watching so much good tennis, And so that was like, wow. So you do obviously learn by watching, and it's proven scientifically. So, it's all these little aspects and all these little things that contribute to you.
Yeah. Do you remember any, as you were coming up, was there any weakness that you had? Was there something that you really struggled with or that you got stuck with? And then it took a lot of hard work, or maybe some little insight from your friend allowed you to unlock and break through that plateau? Do you remember anything like that?
Yeah. So I had a really wide stance, like really crabby, and really ugly. And I think, I don't remember exactly when I started fixing it or working on it, but I obviously watching videos, and I had a buddy of mine that we surfed a lot together, and we push each other, and we kind of like, hey, no, do this better, you do that. So the stance was a big one for me at the beginning. And then I remember, because then going back to Venezuela and surfing, obviously as a pro surfer already, I used to go back home a lot. And all friends of mine that watch me grow up, they will say, man, like your timing, your surfing, you look effortless nowadays. Like it changed so much. You used to be kind of spastic, and your stance was a little wider, so it was not as pleasant, to the eye, and not as effective. So I think that that was one of the things that I struggled at first, but then shortly after '93, I moved to California, and then it was, that whole thing went to another level, being able to watch Taylor Knox and Todd Prestige and Rob Machado, and I lived in Oceanside from '93 all the way to like 2010, more or less. So it's like, that's another part of my life. I lived in California for nearly almost 20 years. So that definitely, polished everything that has to do with surfing in my life, where, from being a professional to relationships, to how you relate to people, to shapers, to surfboards, to surfing beach rakes, to surfing point breaks, cold water, running into Magnum Martinez, to, like this legends.
So how did moving to California help you fix your stance? And you said your timing. Those are the two things that you said your friends like noticed, kind of that effortless timing and flow. So let's focus on the stance, for example. Like, what was it, a really gradual process, or was it a really conscious thing that you had to do? I'm sure a lot of people struggle with fixing their stance. So I'm sure people would love to hear how you fixed it for yourself.
Yeah. And like I said, if I would have had a coach to point it out and film me and then tell me, and on land, this is how you do it, it's so this wide, or this is why you're stepping so wide, your stance is so wide, and this is how you can correct it, it would have been a lot easier, a lot faster, a lot less painful, but so to me, it was just like that drive to just get better no matter what. Like, there was not an option for me not to get better, because now I'm 19, I'm in California, I gotta wait tables, I gotta bus tables, I gotta deliver stickers, surfboards, like print whatever I could get my hands on. And then, but at the same time, I'm in one of the meccas, so I'm looking at surfers that are way polished, that are really good surfers and talented, plus the surfers that I got inserted through Michael Barron from Burn Surfboards into like Oceanside, and I got to the factory right off a plane, and he gave me a board and a wetsuit and grabbed one of his team riders back in the day, John Brandy. He's like, "You're gonna be staying with him have fun. And I didn't even speak English. So it was like, holy moly, I got thrown into the mix dead on in early 90s. These guys were listening to punk rock, doing bong rips every morning. And I was just like, cultural shock at its best. But it was such a beautiful opportunity for me to learn. And then, and then I met Corey King, and he worked for Linden. Then I met Gary Linden. And, there's so many stories I have to tell you, but it was being surrounded by these guys and the Burn team, like Jeremy Hyatt, like, I don't know, Jason Bennett was a little kid back in the day. And so it was really cool because they paid more attention. They were kind of very, I will say they were very like self-conscious about style back then. It was like a thing. And I was coming from the other side of like raw, like just try to destroy anything, to like, oh, wait a second. These guys are really paying more attention to style and technique. So it wasn't like anyone was telling me things. It was like I started picking up things, and then I started watching myself in video, because those guys will video each other every now and then be like, oh, okay, this is where, this is how I can fix my stance. And it was just more like, just bring that front foot back. It wasn't like a special technique like I've done with Shakti, to like I put the board flat on the sand and be like, okay, step this wide and no pins on the sand, and like trying to move the board, like, like stand forward on the board with a wider stance. Now step back, all the way to your back foot's on the tail and your front foot's not too wide. And now move the board, and the board just, easily moves. And it's like, you understand now how and why you need to be back on the tail to make the board feel more responsive and more maneuverable, right? Obviously, that's just a stance at certain things that you're doing in the wave, because you're driving, you're more forward, blah, blah, blah. But it was, it was just trial and error. A lot of, watching and learning and watching and learning, but not a lot of coaching from anybody in particular.
It was just kind of osmosis from being surrounded by so many good surfers and people, just them being so conscious about their style. And I think that's really interesting. And so that drill that you mentioned with Shakti, so that's just having her stand on that surfboard. That's to help her understand why you want to sit on the back of the surfboard. But then let's say, maybe she is struggling. She's not far back enough on the surfboard, or her stance is too wide. Are there any tips that you give her to kind of fix or make adjustments when you're in the water? Or, maybe not Shakti, but any of your surfers that you coach? Like, how do you fix that for one of your surfers? How do you remind them, hey, you needed to make these adjustments?
Yeah, there is a few techniques or approaches to it, from, a line, or where you want their foot to not be any pass forward from. So you put like a line with a color wax. You can take off the wax, so when they put the foot too far forward, they feel like they don't have traction. It's a little bit dangerous, risky, because you can slip and fall, and you don't want to hurt yourself, obviously. But so, and then there's also little marks that you can put on your surfboard to like remind you of things, and not just with your stance, but maybe rotation, compression, and all these things to remind you. Because the hardest thing about surfing is it's like constant motion, movement, changing. So there's so many things you have to do in order to catch a wave, that by the time you catch a wave, you forget of what you were out there to work on. Unless you got certain level that you're like, no, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to compress off the bottom turn, and you catch that wave and you do it. But that's not always the case, it depends on your level. So there's all these little tips that you can apply, like I said, like color wax, or take the wax off, or put something on the nose of your board that reminds you of when you stand up, to that foot needs to be back. But also, where are you like laying on your board? Are you too far forward? How's your pop-up when you bring that front foot? Where is it landing on? Is it too far? You're used to spread out. And so I think it's very unique to the person, into the mechanics of their body or how they actually get to the point of standing up on their board, then you can be like, okay, that person maybe needs this correction on this way and not that way, you know, like maybe it's all prior to actually standing up that you can fix their stance, you know.
So that's really fascinating. You know, I've thought about that as well. But if, let's say, you have somebody that struggles with ending up too far forward on their surfboard, they're not far back enough, would you actually recommend they paddle a little bit further back on the surfboard? Because the problem is you'll probably pop up further back, but then you'll also not paddle into the wave as easily, right? So there's that kind of two pros and cons of that approach. Is that what you recommend, or is it more that you paddle in the same place to get into the wave easy, but you just make sure to, when you pop up, you push back to get onto the back of the surfboard? Kind of what's your recommendation there?
Yeah, and I think it really is unique to the person and how their mechanics, how they move their bodies, how they pop up, because you can do that like if they're a little too forward on the board, which it happens, you know, then just by then scooting back, you know, on the board, then when they stand up, it's like, oh, now they're further back and you may fix the problem then. Otherwise, they may have to pay more attention to when they plant their back foot to be farther back, you know, and then as they stand up, you know, if, you know, then you have the front foot problem, you know, if you didn't correct it by planting your back foot further back, then you need to address that. So you need to see like what, you know, I ask a lot of questions as a coach because we can, you know, as a coach that has a good amount of knowledge, you can give and communicate all this knowledge of all you want. But the truth of the matter is everybody learns in different ways. You know, we do not all learn the same way. So I like to ask questions, and based on the response I get from my clients or my students, then I know more intuitively how to approach that and how to make them, like, you know, give them the adjustments that make sense to them. And I want them to understand it. I want them to break them down. I ask them, tell me, how do you do it? Like, so now what do you think it's going on? How do you think you can fix it? And then get into that conversation, because what I want to do is actually create awareness in them so they can become more aware of what they're doing, their movements, their stance, their body mechanics, so they can become better surfers and actually fix themselves, you know, instead of being like, do this and not really, you know, why.
It does. Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. So it doesn't make, yeah, no, totally. So this actually brings up something that's interesting. You know, I think there's this debate in surfing. Is style something you learn, or is it something that's natural? What do you think?
Oh, well, you know, it's interesting because I see people focusing, like, to my personal opinion, over focusing on style. And I think style has a lot to do with technique, right? Like when you have a proper technique or an efficient technique, then style kind of comes through. But then you can work on certain things to, like, exaggerating or accentuating certain movements or your stance or your posture, and that adds to your style, right? So if we think about it, let's go. I'll go all out and put myself out there and talk about Craig Anderson. You know, he's an amazing surfer, but to me, his style is just so, like, he works so hard on looking a certain way that to me doesn't look natural, you know? And he's an amazing surfer, and I have nothing negative to say about him. Personally, I'd rather look at somebody like Rob Machado that has such an amazing technique that his style comes because his technique is so polished. His arm placement, the way he looks, the way he rotates his hands, you know, it's so, the way he walks on the board, he stands, that creates that style, you know, instead of trying to look a certain way and then kind of forcing that into, you know, into your technique. I'm not saying one is wrong or one it's right. That we're all different, and it's an expression. Your style is an expression of yourself, and it should be unique, to yourself. But what I'm saying is, I see it when it's natural, like Aki. Like Aki is just raw. He is raw, and he has one of the best styles ever. I love the way he serves. He's just raw, but then he has really good arm placement sometimes. But then on a backside snap or reentry, he barely rotates his torso. He's all torque. He's so strong that he doesn't need to rotate the torso like I do, or like maybe a thinner guy, lighter guy has to do to create more torque, or even like Mick Fanning. His torso is like a, wind up, that wind up effect with his hips. And Aki's just like just one powerful powerhouse. So it's like, then his style kind of, it's because of his body build, and then Curran has that style, and then Kelly had his style, and his style changed because he started applying more pressure to his surfing and going more radical, and then his style suffered. Like Kelly, and sorry, Kelly, I love you, but his style, when you see him in the early 90s, was just like, oh, I watch him till the day. It was like the most flawless, most beautiful thing to watch, because it was like the best mix of like Curran with like this innovation and this flow and this flair, and it was just like nothing better. There was nothing better. So good. And then it changed because he started going crazy after some crazy turns, and I don't know, maybe his hips or who knows what exactly, like, but it definitely changed. He still surfs beautiful. He still has an amazing technique, but it definitely changed. It's not where it used to be. And then if we can talk quickly about Ethan Urin, then you're like, wow, look at that technique and that style. It's like the marriage. It's almost like a perfect marriage, right? So there's so much to talk about.
It's gorgeous, yeah. Well, so when you said earlier that you think some surfers focus too much on style. And I guess the question is, let's say you're a beginner surfer versus an intermediate surfer versus an advanced surfer. And obviously it depends how you define it, right? But let's say you're a beginner surfer, you're kind of trying to figure out how to catch waves and ride down the line. You're not really doing maneuvers yet. Let's say intermediate is somebody that is starting to work on maneuvers, and they can do maneuvers. And then advanced, they're doing maneuvers extremely well, and they're just trying to refine it. For each stage, how would you say, what emphasis should there be on style?
Yeah, so I will suggest to focusing more on proper technique, on proper posture, on proper arm placement, right? Without being too rigid, right? Like, I don't tell my surfers, hey, change your style, looks horrible. Or like, I'm like saying, I just go like, hey, if you bend your back arm, I'm a regular, if I bend my arm and all of a sudden my arm leaning, like before I get to the forearm, it's extended like that, it's my hands pointing that way, right? The moment I bend my elbow, my hand can point up, can point forward, can point down. So just that right there, it's one of the best examples to just adjusting one part of your body can change your weight distribution, your projection, and a lot of things. So more than style, I focus on technique, because I think style is something that it's really innate, and I wouldn't dare to actually be like, like you should change your style. But if I see a lot of surfers that sometimes they look really good posture, like back knee a little knocked in, the hand, like hands pointing forward, but then they can't get the ball on the rail. And I'm like, what's the point? You have all this perfect posture, but you're so over-focused on that, you haven't even learned how to put the ball on the rail and do a proper rail turn. So it's surfing is very unique, and it's not an easy sport to like teach, to coach, to actually, do these adjustments to change and better your technique. But I will definitely focus on technique, posture prior to to style. And then I will suggest, okay, if you want to do something and you want it to look certain way, why don't you do this, based on technique, and feel how that arm being lower, what it does to your style. How are you going to look? And then based on that look, coming from technique, from position, arm positioning or compression or rotation, then how does that look? Does that look better? That's it. More importantly, does it feel better? Is it more, it's smoother? Is there more flow in the movement, more harmony, And then
right.
I think that's the way I approach my coaching more. It's more like that than, put your arm like this and let your hand and your front arm, let it dead, don't move it. I don't approach it like that.
Right. Well, I think what you're saying has a lot of truth to it. And it's almost like there's a certain level of style, which is just good technique, right? If you have bad technique, for example, your stance is too wide or whatever it might be, right? That is bad technique and also going to be bad style. But then once you get to a certain level, as long as your technique is sound and the fundamentals of your technique are sound, then the style is just an expression or an extension of it. And there's all sorts of variations, right? So from Craig Anderson to Rob Machado to Ethan Ewing. And then at that level, it becomes more personal, but there's still that foundation of good technique at the base of it. So it's it's like kind of it's the cherry on top, right? Mm-hmm. Is that what kind of you're saying?
Yeah, exactly. And I'll give you my daughter's example, Shakti, and to go back to, because I think it's very valid point. Like, I never really told her anything about style. Her style is her expression. It's how she writes a way of how she flows through movements. But what I really made an emphasis on, it's technique. Ride the wave, like surf the wave, be on the right part of the wave, or where there's energy, and be efficient with your movements. She doesn't do this, thank God. She surfs on the rail. She keeps the board on the rail constantly. And when I see that, and it's like people are like, they really are drawn to her style, but because her technique it's efficient, it's a proper technique, and there's variations and things and tweaks that you can do. But like when she does like a frontside top turn and blows the tail and goes into a layback, that's all her expression. I'm behind her telling her, if you extend your back leg, you're going to kick the tail and you're going to compress your front leg. You shift your weight to your front leg, and your tail is going to have less friction, and you are going to be able to throw that tail easier. On top of that, if you use your back arm and you swing it, it's going to help bring that chest to your front leg and release the weight and shift the weight from your tail to your front leg. It's going to release easier. You're going to have, at the end of the turn, a better, your weight distribution is going to be better balance. You're going to come out of the turn usually better. And then she adds her own spin to it, and so that's why to me, and style, it's a very personal thing. And usually if somebody wants to look a certain way, which I really haven't, and I think a good example is somebody that has a narrow stance and they look good, but then they can't compress because they're too narrow, they're too tied up, and then it's affecting their surfing. And anyone will look at them and like, wow, it looks graceful. Look how cool that stance and stuff. But then it's so limiting to your performance, right? So that's when you have to be careful with it. And I'd rather focus on proper technique with mechanics behind it to help understand the student why certain things are better than other things, and to actually find what works for you. Because like I said, not everybody moves the same way. Not everybody has the same center of gravity or the same way to learn things. So it's really fascinating that way, because you never stop learning.
Right. Well, what are some of the most common mistakes you see technique-wise then?
Man, it's interesting in women, and I'll go straight to the point. Even on on high levels, I see a lot of bend from the hips. They compress to a certain extent, and then it's a lot of bending from the hips instead of bending the knees, and compressing more without bending from the hips. And that obviously has a huge effect on how much power you can put on your turns, how hard you can push, because if you're bending forward, and you have your torso and your head that weigh a lot, and you're too forward, then you can't push really hard because your rail is going to disengage at one point. So being compressed and bending the legs more, it's going to give you a lot more. And I tell people, hey, your legs are like a spring, like springs, or like shock absorbers, but they're springs. The more you load, the more energy comes out of them. So you got to use that to your advantage. And I give him the example of the pro surfers. Like, look at Felipe Toledo. Look how much he compresses and extends his legs, and how much energy he creates, and in speed, and force from doing that, right? So in women, I see that's kind of like a pattern, because the way they're built differently than men, So with men, it's different, but also it's like, set the board on the rail, hold the rail as long as you can, transfer your weight. And also, like, I think in general, man, women, compression gets overlooked a lot, because weight distribution is super important, but compression also, and the rotation. I like to say, like, the components of rotation are 3 on your upper body, which is your arms, your shoulders, and your head. And that needs to be in unison. There needs to be follow through, right? And I use the example of a tennis swing or of a golf swing, even baseball. You don't hit a tennis, you don't go back and hit it and stop, right? You swing through, and all of a sudden the tennis racket's pointing the other way and the ball's going that way. Tennis racket's pointing that way. Why? Because if you stop the motion, even though the contact's already happened and the ball left the surface of the racket, that follow through, it's very important to not cut that motion, and to kind of, it's like extension of all that energy of that movement, So I use a lot of martial arts, kicks, punching, all this stuff, and how you use your hips, how you use all this momentum and all this body mechanics to create a full, complete movement. And for men, I feel like sometimes, because they're a little bit more aggro generally, but not on all cases, they want to they want to throw a lot more spray. They just they cut the flow because they're cutting turns short. So a lot of the times is, let's work on holding that rail longer, keep the board on the rail, because if the board's on the rail, you're going to be able to push longer, harder, because it's not only the fins holding you in the water, it's also the rail. Also, the boards with the rocker, if they're flat, they don't project. They're going to spin like that. But if they're on the rail and that line, the rocker, the bottom can turn, that's what's going to create projection. That creates a more amplitude on your turns. The turn looks bigger, more, it just looks better, right? So it's kind of like, let's understand the mechanics of the surfboard, of surfing, of the face of the wave, of the right turn for the right section with the right amount of speed that you need to do that turn on that section. And then let's apply it to it, and let's see how it feels, right? And then also, the rotation, the weight shifting, the compression at the end of it. But I'm like, those are things that I'm like, like, if you don't reload, if you don't compress on the bottom turn, then you're leaving energy and speed behind that you're not using, right? And then if you're not recoiling your back leg before you turn, then you're not going to have enough. It's like trying to push from here or push from here. You're going to have more force behind it the more recoiling there is. and also, but there's so much stuff to it, all these aspects, so that's why surfing is so hard, and then put the board on the rail, then look over your shoulder, then start pressing gradually, then shift your way, then finish, your turn. So hence, it's not easy to teach, right? Or even to do it yourself.
Yeah, that's why surfing's the hardest sport in the world for sure. So, hey, yeah, and that breakdown and that advice is really useful. And so how do you, get people to make these changes in their technique, right? Like compressing. Everybody knows mentally, or a lot of people know mentally, I need to compress more. But like, how do you actually get Shakti or one of your clients to compress more? Does it go back to, what you mentioned where, you have a note, on your surfboard or anything like that, or they're just like, you go out, how do you get your students to make these actual adjustments? I think that's always the hard part. People know mentally they need to make changes, but then for the example, like cutting your turn short, that's a very common issue, right? How do you get them to change that?
Well, two things, like with the compression, and the first compression, it starts on the bottom turn, right? So if you want to start there, if it's backside is a little trickier, but there's ways to do it with your arm placement, your hands placement. If you're doing a backside bottom turn and your back hand is high, then it's not going to help you compress. But if you bring that hand lower towards the rail of your board, like if you were going to grab it, but you don't need to grab it, but bring it lower, it's going to help you compress more. It's going to feel more natural to want to get that compression, bend more the knees. Obviously, your front hand needs to be that like pivoting like hand where you're going to pivot around. And front side, it's instead of, you see a lot of that wind up, right? On the back arm going like that. But truthfully, when you have a bigger canvas and you do that, you're not being efficient with your projection of the face, because as soon as you do that and you decompress, that's it. You're not going to accelerate that much more. But if your front arm, it's bent, and instead of touching the water on your bottom turn, you bend the arm and you want to put like your forearm on the water, that's going to help you need to get lower, because then your arm's too high. If you want to have that elbow and that forearm closer to water, you're going to have to bend your knees more. And that, if you hold that compression like that, as you come off the bottom, it's going to do that slingshot effect up the face. So obviously it takes a lot of practice, and there's things you can do outside of the water, certain squatting, lunges, like all these different exercises, jumps, and all this stuff that it's going to help, because like ultimately the repetitions was going to create that new habit. And if you don't do it on land, it's going to be really hard for you to do it in the water, when how many ways do you catch in a session, all the distractions, all the things. But on land, you can do, 100 squats or 100 reps of anything that you want to work on like that in a few minutes. So you gotta understand how the brain works, to create a new habit, repetition. And how many times, how many hours does it take? In Pilates, they said that neurological and neuromuscular connection takes more or less 4 or 5 hours, to engage the pelvic floor. What? Try that when you haven't done it in the first 3 hours. You're like, pelvic floor, what are you talking about? But then through practice and repetition, all of a sudden, that connection gets established. And then it's like, oh, I can actually engage the pelvic floor. I didn't even know it existed for 30 years. You know what I mean? So
never heard about anybody. Yeah, I've never heard about anybody talk about pelvic floor in relation to surfing. That's fascinating.
Well, that's Pilates, and I don't really use that, but that's like, that's a scientific, proven point that you need certain amount of repetition to actually create a new habit, certain amount of hours doing something to create a new habit. And if not only you're creating a new habit, you're actually changing an old habit. So it's not easy. So it takes a lot of, focus, repetition, proper technique. I see a lot of people like using the skateboards, and I use them with some of my clients, Surski, Carver, you call it, you know, all these really good like boards that are out there to correct your technique. But like one thing I say is like, if you go out and you are doing exactly what you do in the water on the skateboard, then all you're going to do is cement that habit that you want to change. So it's not going to do you any good. Make sure you're doing it properly first and then repeat yourself. Make sure you know that those repetitions are the proper technique or the proper posture, and then repeat them until you create the new habit.
Right. Like they say, what is it? You don't want to imperfect, well, I forget how it goes. It's like imperfect practice is just going to, you practice the wrong thing over and over again, you're just going to get worse, right? You have to practice perfectly. You got to figure out what the perfect technique is, and then you practice it, and that's actually how you get good. And I think that's what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think martial arts have, you know, you can learn that from martial arts, you know, and know how tedious it could be.
Yeah. Well, I know you got to head out of here. You're going to go to the Pan Am Games pretty soon. But I just want to say thank you. We learned a ton from all your advice here. And how should people reach out to you if they want to work with you?
Thank you for having me. And I wish you had more time, but I'm running around. Hey, you know what? I'm really organic when it comes to my coaching. I don't advertise it, hardly anything, but I have an Instagram. And I almost can my coaching one because it's just too much for me. I like keeping things simple. And I believe the best advertising is a word of mouth. You know, if you worked with me and you liked what I taught you, you learned something, then that person's going to tell other people. But cutting through the chase, Magnum Martinez, at Magnum Martinez on Instagram. I don't check my Instagram every day. I don't respond to messages all the time. I do my best to, like, you know, every 3-4 days, you know, I check them and make sure there's nothing important there that's going by unnoticed. But that's pretty much what I do. My company is called Integral Surf Coaching. I work with this Surf Coach Manager platform online. We do online coaching, and it's a really integral, robust platform that you can do a lot of things from like beginning level to, like, you know, high performance, top notch athletes, and you know, create that kind of like evaluation and the follow through with athletes. So there's all kinds of tools out there. There's a lot of good coaches nowadays out there. But if you want to try my stuff, I'm here in Puerto Rico. I run training camps in Central America, in California, and Panama, and El Salvador, and Costa Rica, and here in Puerto Rico. I coach I'm the head coach for the National Federation of Puerto Rico nowadays. And I'm going to go hang out with Max Torres, who's our newest SUP Surf World Champ. And hopefully I can I can help him get to the podium. It's all his work, just on, you know, adding a little bit of grain of sand to the cost.
All right. Well, nice. Thanks again, Magnum. I'll see you around.
All right, brother. Thanks for having me.
Hey, everyone. It's Van. Hopefully you've been enjoying the podcast. Hopefully you've been listening to some good stories, getting some good tips that are helping you improve as a surfer. If so, make sure to subscribe to the podcast, leave us a review. It'll only take you literally a few seconds, and share it with your friends. That's the best way you can support me so I can continue to create awesome new content for you. So thanks.